all the European countries are ready to support Ukraine in its fight against empire, against dictatorship, and, in my opinion, against the universal evil.
Russia has effectively accelerated Ukraine's European path, and that is what we see today. The membership of the European Union is absolutely a realistic goal for Ukraine. And I would even venture so far as to say that it is a historical responsibility of the leaders of both Ukraine and Europe to ensure that that happens.
Everybody understands that the combat activities, they obviously hamper Ukraine's accession to the EU, and Putin understands this quite well. And because of this reason, he's not going to finish them in order to have the hot conflict.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic course. I'm your host, Varvara Shmygalova. In today's episode, we'd like to discuss the recent Ukraine-EU summit in Kyiv, which had brought many positive signals for Ukraine. Despite the fact that Kyiv's call for fast-track path to EU membership has not been granted as many had expected, European institution has praised Ukraine's progress toward achieving the criteria to join the EU and promised more help and support for Ukraine. They pledged a 10th round of sanctions against Russia to coincide with the first anniversary of Russia's full-scale war. It also announced a doubling of the numbers of Ukrainian troops to be trained by the EU to 30,000 in 2023 and promised 25 million for demining areas recaptured by Ukraine. If you want to find more about this subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our videos in the future. To start, please welcome Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, People's Deputy, head of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Ukraine's integration into the European Union. She will provide us with an understanding what was the focal point of this summit, security or European integration, as well as remind about the reasons for Ukraine's aspiration to join the Union.
On February 3rd, Ukraine participated in the summit in new status, the status of the candidate country, which was a new status and a new position for Ukraine. I agree with you, Igor, that there were two trends of discussions. I mean, the security and the Euro-integrational ones. And I should say that the security dimension prevailed during our discussions. And the European Union continuously keeps saying that all the European countries are ready to support Ukraine in its fight against empire, against dictatorship, and, in my opinion, against the universal evil. And for us, it is very important that there's all European unity in this, in supporting Ukraine, would be preserved, and that readiness to provide us with political and humanitarian support would continue. And for us, it is also important that the European Union would increase pressure upon Russia via sanctions. And I hope that there's a vision of needed sanctions. The vision from Ukraine will be considered when deciding about the 11th package of sanctions. Then I believe that during the summit, the European Union has opened several programs, several EU programs available for Ukraine. Although it was just mentioned in general about Ukraine's access to the European economic market. Actually, this means that Ukrainian enterprises would be able to participate in some bidding for goods and services. The European Commission will extend the privileges for taxes and duties on Ukrainian products which are being supplied to the European market. And I think this is important for Ukrainian economy. Ukraine should not produce slogans which can mislead people and create and just make an appearance of something. And I agree with Vitaliy that today we are fighting for our own right to choose, to disagree, to have discussions. For us, this is the war against dictatorship and empire and an empire. And because of that, all the free world today is supporting us and stay with us. We may recollect that back in 2014 here at Maidan, there was a huge big board saying that freedom was our religion. To some extent, this is true. Ukrainian leaders should not forget that Ukrainian society, this is about freedom, about democracy, and about different opportunities. That's why.
Next, please hear from Tobias Tyberg, the ambassador of the Kingdom of Sweden to Ukraine. He will elaborate on why the political element of Ukraine's continuous integration with Europe has become so important in recent years.
You're absolutely right that the political elements of Ukraine's continued integration with Europe has become more important in the recent year, and the reason why is very, very simple. The reason why is because on the 28th of February 2022, Ukraine applied for membership in the European Union. That's the answer to your question. In order to become a member of the European Union, in order to be eligible for membership in the European Union, a country needs to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, and these are criteria which refer to the most fundamental political values that Europe stands for. These are issues of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. So I think that's the simple answer to your question. It's really not much more complicated than that. The context within which this happened was obviously the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, and I think the reason why the invasion has launched this increased attention on the political elements of European integration is because that invasion finally eliminated any hope that there could be a way for Ukraine to continue integrating with Europe in a way which wouldn't be met by Russian aggression. Russia has effectively accelerated Ukraine's European path, and that is what we see today. There's sort of two things which need to be kept in mind at the same time. The first one is look at how far Ukraine has already come. And these issues are not new. These issues have already been there. This is the nature of politics, and this is the nature of political change. There are always very strong interests that need to that collide when historical political decisions are made, and that does not mean that historical political changes cannot be made. So I think, whereas I agree with every individual point that Mr. Portnikov makes, I think that the general impression that his intervention leaves is too pessimistic, because if it were the case that every time there are political challenges in the way of achieving certain goals, those goals cannot be realized, then Europe today wouldn't look the way it looks. If you just recall what Europe looked like 30 years ago and compare it to what Europe looks like today, these are two different worlds. And despite this horrific war that we're seeing in Europe today, I think there can be no doubt that Europe today is a better place than Europe 30 years ago. And that is exactly because the kind of challenges that Mr. Portnikov refers to have been overcome. But this requires obviously great political leadership. And it does require the leadership within Europe, of the European institutions and of the individual European member states, and it requires the leaders of Ukraine to show that they are up to the magnitude of the challenges, the historical challenges we face today. So I think I cannot sort of presume to put a kind of a time estimate to when it will happen, but I think that membership of the European Union is absolutely a realistic goal for Ukraine. And I would even venture so far as to say that it is a historical responsibility of the leaders of both Ukraine and Europe to ensure that that happens. I think in the context of a war of aggression of the kind that Ukraine is currently the victim of at the hands of the Russian Federation, I think it is very natural for there to be a strong focus on the centralization of power, and I think that's understandable and that's normal. But I think it's also extremely important that Ukraine fully recognizes that one of the reasons why Ukraine has been able to withstand this Russian aggression so successfully, one of the key reasons is exactly because Ukrainian institutions, Ukrainian democratic constitutional institutions were so much stronger than the Russian Federation thought. Obviously, Russia wildly underestimated the strength of Ukrainian society, of the Ukrainian economy, of the Ukrainian military, and of Ukrainian institutions. And I think that one of the very important things now is that in the context of this war, it is extremely important that Ukrainian authorities ensure an environment where those institutions can continue to function and continue to develop. Now, why do I say this in the context of a certain centralization of executive power, which is natural and normal in a time of war? I say it specifically, I'd like to mention one particular reform, and that is local self-government. I believe that one of the many reasons why Ukraine so successfully withstood the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022 was because Russian municipalities, hromadas all over the country, had been empowered through decentralization reform of the past many years into a position where they took responsibility for their own communities rather than waiting to be told by Kiev what to do. And I think that triggered a huge creative power and huge amount of initiative all over Ukraine to do the things that needed to be done at all levels, from the military to the economic to the social, to ensure Ukrainian survival against this aggression. And I think that the successful reform, decentralization reform, was one of the reasons why that worked so spectacularly successfully. And I think this is just one key example of how important it is that Ukraine's democratic institutions continue to develop. So I think this would be the one thing that I would suggest that Ukraine must not do going forward, and that is to allow the consolidation of executive power, which is a natural and normal consequence of the war, to be allowed to start eroding the extremely important democratic reforms that Ukraine has successfully conducted in the last 30 years.
Further, please welcome Vitaliy Portnikov, publicist, TV presenter, and writer. He will speak about why Putin is interested in the ongoing war with regards to the European integration of Ukraine, EU bureaucracy, and challenges that were successfully overcame in the past.
What is important for us? First of all, the end of combat activities and the situation with Ukrainian borders as of this moment, and nobody knows the final date for the war. And everybody understands that the combat activities, they obviously hamper Ukraine's accession to the EU, and Putin understands this quite well. And because of this reason, he's not going to finish them in order to have the hot conflict. It seems to me that this is a natural situation in the EU. There is a European Commission which deals with the issues related to the existence of the EU, which is able to see the global dimension in Europe and of Europe, especially when we speak about Mr. Charles Michel and Ms. Ursula von der Leyen. They are enthusiastic about European project, and not only in terms of Ukraine or Moldova, but also in terms of the Western Balkans. And the example with Bosnia and Herzegovina is a good example, which seemed impossible a year ago. This is all done with the intention to create united Europe, which is not a union with holes on the map. Of course, it's good if a hole looks like Switzerland, but it's bad if this hole looks like Bosnia and Herzegovina.
You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!